Next, we're going to talk about health risks related to potential liability, and Jack Dresser is going to make this presentation. Then there's going to be one more, then there'll be questions and answers.
So I have one study here that confirms what Joe was talking about. It's a review of 919 studies that were done around the world, and of the effects of, now what I'm going to be talking about all has to do with cell phone towers. And obviously smart meters haven't been around enough, long enough to really study intensively, but cell phone towers have been around for quite a while. And they emit a very similar type of radiation. It's and it's a continuous radiation, just like smart meters would emit. If you're talking on the cell phone, that's periodic and it's voluntary. If you operate the microwave, that's periodic and voluntary. Smart meters are not voluntary, and cell phone towers are not voluntary. So of these over 900 studies that were done around the world, almost 600 of them, 593, showed negative impact of mobile towers on birds, bees, humans, wildlife, and plants. So Joe's observations are confirmed around the world. So for our purposes, of course, we want to look very closely at the effects on humans, since we're narcissistic as a species, you know. So the World Health Organization has conducted and sponsored quite a number of studies around the world, and 12 different groups in 7 countries, all documented using in vitro methodology. And in vitro is very important because you take cells and you have controls and experimental, and everything else is held constant. There are no confounds like you have in any kind of field studies or in vivo studies. So these are in vitro studies seeing how microwave radiation affects human cells. And all of these groups found that this radiation creates DNA damage, broken DNA. And these are, of course, implicated in the origin of cancers. So the World Health Organization drew some conclusions from this, you know, very cautious conclusions. And they, in fact, recommend what they call the precautionary principle. I mean, we don't have to prove that smart meters are unsafe. They have to prove that they are safe. If there is reasonable doubt about the safety of smart meters, it's up to them to dispel that doubt, not up to us. And that's the precautionary principle that is recommended by the World Health Organization. And these studies that I mentioned were sponsored by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And they identify these radiofrequency electromagnetic fields as possibly carcinogenic. There's even a journal on this now, if anybody wants to look up this journal. It's the Journal of Bioelectromagnetics. It has all kinds of studies on this subject. Now, if you look at this, this is just from Wikipedia. If you look at this report on Wikipedia describing this, there are 91 peer-reviewed published studies that they're citing. Now, you know what I look at when I look at those 91 peer-reviewed studies? I look at a lot of expert witnesses that are going to be on the other side of the table when eWeb gets sued. Because it takes a while for cancers to develop, and so the actual effects of this, which are predictable, are going to be a few years down the line. Now, the graph I was going to show you is very interesting. It shows that the level of full body electromagnetic exposure from smart meters is over 10 times that of cell phones. Now, that's because there's a number of reasons. It has to do with distance, and it has to do with full body exposure, as opposed to exposure that's largely oriented toward the head. But even with cell phones that are largely head-specific in terms of proximity, they found a much higher incidence of glioma, which is the most virulent and most common form of brain cancer, among cell phone users. I've said people have used the cell phone over a long period of time, and it tends to occur primarily on the side of their head where they hold the cell phone. And the WHO concluded that there was, quote, a significantly increased risk of some brain tumors related to the use of cell phones for a period of 10 years or more. So it's going to take a while for all this stuff to show up with smart meter victims. Now, attorneys are no fools. And you know, it costs a great deal of money to take on a personal injury case because attorneys take them on contingency. And they're not going to take one of these on, especially going up against a big adversary with a lot of money. They're not going to be taking these on unless they judge a very high risk of a payoff. Well, one of the top personal injury firms in the United States is taking this on and inviting people to bring lawsuits about cell phones. This is Parker Weichman LLP, if anybody wants to sue. Now, the insurance companies are no fools either. The insurance companies have seen this data that the actual full body exposure from cell phones is much, much less than that among that you're going to get from smart meters. Of course, depending on proximity and so forth. One person who posted on a blog following one of these articles said, you know, we have a smart meter on the wall right outside our bedroom, right on the other side of the wall, and our bed's right on the inside, and we're less than 3 feet away. Well, according to this specialist data, if you're only 3 feet away from a smart meter, you may get 53 to 160 times more whole body radiation than a cell phone held to your ear. So insurance companies are fearing billions of dollars in insurance costs, quote, down the road, even from cell phones. Billions down the road. The smart meter payouts are going to be down the road also. And 60% of insurance underwriters right now are refusing to indemnify cell phone companies, cell towers.
What does that mean in English?
Well, they're not insuring them. They won't give cell phone companies insurance against damage claims related to their the radio frequency radiation from their towers. And they're looking at potential payouts in the 2020 to 2030 period when all these cancers are likely to show up. Just a second. Now, here's one that really got my attention. In Israel, a couple years ago, four plaintiffs filed a class action lawsuit against the 4 major cell phone companies in Israel, asking 3.68 billion shekels. I don't know what the exchange rate is, but that's a lot. And of course, the case isn't finalized yet. But you know what happens in these lawsuits? The minute there's going to be lots of them filed, the minute there's a judgment that survives appeal, that becomes a precedent for negotiating settlements in hundreds and thousands of other lawsuits. Because they know what it's going to cost to go to trial, and it's all a dollar and cents calculation. And when somebody files, when a class action suit is filed of that magnitude, the payout can be enormous. And to get it settled, the settlement's going to be enormous. And the minute a lawsuit is filed, the legal fee meter starts running at what, $200-300 an hour. Now, if there's 150,000 people in Eugene that are exposed to smart meters, and even if a small handful of them develop these conditions that have been related by some kind of medical evidence, not even personal, but have been related to electromagnetic radiation, and they can call, you know, a few hundred expert witnesses who will say, well, yeah, there's a good chance of this. And even if, and of course the defense is going to be, well, but there are other things, there's, you know, what are called secular trends, there's other things in society, there's predisposition, there's genetics, blah, blah, blah. So what they then do is they decide on contributory negligence. Well, maybe cell phones or smart meters didn't cause all of it, but what percentage did it cause? So if you have a $50 million lawsuit, well, we'll settle for 10. Maybe only 20% of it was caused by smart meters. Who's going to pay that? We own this company. Who's going to pay those? Who's going to pay those lawyers? Who's going to pay for those settlements? Who's going to pay for those judgments? Now, and eWeb is not going to be able to say they didn't know. These data are out there. The World Health Organization data is out there. I personally testified in the hearing that Kathy made reference to, and I'll tell you exactly what I said to eWeb. They have been served notice. They cannot say they didn't know. They have a responsibility to know. They have a public responsibility to study this data and to know. And so that's going to be no excuse. So I told them that it had been found that DNA changes in human cells from exposure to electromagnetic radiation emissions have been demonstrated in both in vivo and in vitro laboratory experiments. That DNA changes are potentially carcinogenic, often requiring many years or decades to develop into cancerous tissue. These will only become documented by long-term epidemiologic research. Once demonstrated, having exposed entire populations to carcinogenic emissions will expose eWeb to unpredictable numbers of lawsuits from users who develop cancers identified as attributable to such exposures. Citizens' right to sue public utilities has been established. Win or lose, lawsuits are very expensive. Once initiated, the legal fee meter starts running with unpredictable endpoints. Smart meter opponents include highly credible medical and research professionals generating in every lawsuit a duel of expert witnesses as the meter runs. Enough evidence is now accumulated regarding cell phones, a comparable electromagnetic radiation risk source, that personal injury attorneys are soliciting such lawsuits. Since civil liability cases are typically accepted on a contingency fee basis, attorneys are not willing to invest resources in an expensive process with a high probability of profitable outcomes. And I went on with a few more things. So they have been served notice. They got no excuse. And I think they're in a position where we can very justifiably hold their feet to the fire. Because we're going to be stuck with that. We're going to be stuck with those costs. Well, I guess that's it. Is there anybody